if one receives evil from another, let one not do evil in return. Rather, let him extend love to the enemy, that love might unite them. I've heard all this before in the human Talmud.
Of course you have. Truth is truth. But what you have not yet learned is the way we Drex express the truth.
Hello, listening people.
Hello.
Hi, Bartek. How are you?
Good, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing very well, my friend. Or my enemy. Are you my enemy? I don't know. Or are you my friend, Bartek? Friend Bartek.
No.
Mr. Friend Bartek.
No. I'm not an in-joke.
Okay, fair enough. Bartek, what's happening? Who are we? What's all this about? What's this podcast? Explain it to me. I'm just a new person. I've just walked in to this forum, and I want to know if there's anything going on here that I want to stay around.
Yes, well, as you said the first important point. This is a podcast.
Okay.
This is the Spit and Polish Presents podcast, specifically the show Pictures Powwow. It's not the mystery box. We should get back to the mystery box at some point, side note. This is Pictures Powwow, our weekly show where we review a movie and we give it a recommendation or not.
Yes, and the movies have come recommended, whether it's a recommendation from yourself, from me, or our own listening people. That's right, people listening. That's you. You can recommend movies to us. We'll add it to our holly jolly list of movies, which is actually quite small at the moment. We need some more movie recommendations, people. We can't just keep doing the same movies over and over again. You need to give us some more. But yeah, we are talking about movies that have come recommended, but we're not alone for this one, Bartek. We had to enlist some people in to discuss the movie that has come recommended. That's the title of this episode, which we'll get into. But Bartek, who have we enlisted? Who have we marooned on this little island, on this little planet, to come talk to us about a movie?
We've got some old friends coming back. I think this is their third time on Pictures Powwow.
Lucky. Third time's the charm.
I thought you said Lockie. I'm like, no, not Lachlan. He has been on twice, but not third yet. No, it is our friends from Chatz Telelvision Podcast, Alan and Magellan.
Hello!
Your Mickey Mouse is one big stupid dope.
Thank you. Well,
Mickey Mouse is
I
American,
could ruin the
so
food,
take that.
you could frighten the customers.
We watched the movie.
We reference the movie to let everyone know that we actually watched it. Unlike those other podcasts that don't watch it and skip over things. Don't like them at all. But, Alan, Magellan, which one's which? To let everyone know who's Alan, who's Magellan.
I
Alan, you
refuse.
can go first.
Oh, well, there you see, you spoiled it, because I said, Magellan, we should go into the Zoom call and write our names as opposite people to confuse Ryan and Bartek. But, no, I'm Alan.
We don't
I'm
look at the
Alan.
screen.
Oh, that's fair. I'm one of the co-hosts of Chatz, the Telelvision Podcast.
Yeah, I'm another one. My name's Magellan. What's up, everybody? I like the implication, by the way, Ryan, with your role-playing of like a new person, that there's somebody out there who's so desperately looking for a podcast episode about Enemy Mine that they're like, finally, here I am. I don't know who these guys are.
It's
I'm
me.
stranded on a planet.
No, it's me, because here's the thing, like, I recommended Enemy Mine, and I find a lot of interesting videos, podcast material that reference and or review or discuss these type of properties, like something like Enemy Mine, which is a very overlooked, forgotten about sci-fi movie from the 80s, or Babylon 5, which is a show that you guys have covered in the past on your show. And like, I think it is valuable. Like we had a whole show when we started where we talked about unappreciated masterpieces, these movies that people somewhat know but no one really talks about. And it's like, yeah, Enemy Mine, there is somebody out there who's like, oh, someone's talking about Enemy Mine. Okay, cool, because it's like, it's a movie that exists and it has some merits to it. It has some flaws too, and we'll all talk about it, but like, yeah, there's someone here who's just like, whose Pictures Powwow? Why they spin polish? Is polish like polishing the shoes, or polish the people? And it's the people.
And if it's a bad movie, we polish the turd.
Yeah, exactly, Bartek. You got it right there. So Alan, Magellan, tell us a bit about your show, Chatz, a television podcast. It's kind of in the name there. You chat. about a television podcast. Which podcast do you chat about?
John, I can take this one.
Sure, go for it.
So we chats about TV shows mainly in the cult classic realm, shows that people love but don't talk about as much, similar to Pictures Powwow. Shows that we think deserve either a closer look or a zoom in or a reconsideration, what have you. We've covered a variety of shows in the past 5 years, things like Farscape, Babylon 5, as Ryan mentioned, Avatar: The Last Airbender, Freaks and Geeks, and we've even dived into the realm of more live-action stuff like Aaron Sorkin's The Newsroom, as well as Studio 60 on the Sunset Strip, and some more smaller-scale, short-run stuff like Better Off Ted and Pushing Daisies. So, a broad spectrum of television. We love TV and we don't know how to stop talking about it. We're broken and we're trapped in this prison.
They're trapped in the little box and they're stuck, and we have to switch the channels like Mr. Burns running across each different TV show when he was in The Simpsons. Remember when he ran over and he's just like,
the Bobo episode?
"You're never going to escape me," and is out of breath. Yes. Even relevant to this discussion, we are talking about Enemy Mine, a movie, people, if you have not seen, definitely should. We're going to be talking spoilers about it. It's from 1985. The brief plot synopsis of it is: two warring races, a human and an alien, shoot each other down and land on a barren wasteland planet and have to survive. They have to get over their bigotry, over their prejudice, and learn to cope with one another and survive the elements, and things ensue from there. But why it's also relevant to you guys is you guys covered Roots on your podcast, and one of the lead actors in this movie was in Roots. He was, I can't remember his exact character name, but I kind of remember his role in it. But do you guys want to briefly touch upon that?
Yeah, so we did last summer, we did a stint of a couple miniseries. So we watched the 90s Pride and Prejudice. We watched the HBO John Adams miniseries, and in
with
between
our boy
those,
Paul
we watched...
Giamatti. Everyone loves Paul Giamatti.
Of course. Yeah, it's shout outs to the homie. And then a sandwich in between those, we watched the 70s miniseries about a family that lives through and beyond the experience of slavery in the United States, which is called Roots. And people probably are most familiar with Roots through that being the thing that launched LeVar Burton's career. He played Kunta Kinte, who is an individual who is captured in Africa and enslaved and brought to the United States in around like the late 1700s or early 1800s, I think. And Louis Gossett Jr., who plays Jerry in this movie, plays Fiddler, this character named Fiddler in Roots, and he is an enslaved man who plays the fiddle, which is why he's called Fiddler. And he kind of is like a mentor friend figure to LeVar Burton's character. And they have a lot of discussions about what it means to live in an institution like slavery. You know, to what extent do you resist that institution openly? To what extent do you quietly subvert it? And he and Kunta Kinte try to figure out how to navigate those things together. So he's a really interesting and complex character in Roots. And it was cool to see him in this because he's a fantastic
He's an Oscar-winning actor, baby. I mean, one of the things I know, like, Bartek's looking like you don't know Roots at all, really. One of the things that I remember getting, I grew up with Star Trek Next Gen, so I knew about Roots because if you watch Next Gen, one of the comments is always, LeVar Burton, who plays Geordie LaForge, has beautiful, beautiful eyes, and they cover them with this visor.
Yeah.
You want to see his beautiful eyes? Watch Roots. He's got so expressive, so emotive, so much in those eyes. And then Next Gen's like, you know what we should do? Cover those for 7 seasons, 7 years. Cover those bad boys. And when they're off, put the contacts to make you look blind, so you can't even see properly how beautiful, beautiful those eyes are. And of course, in recent years with Roots, I remember the whole thing of Django Unchained, where Quentin Tarantino is basically like, one of his things is, I wanted to do that scene in Roots, but instead of like not whipping the white guy, I wanted him to whip the white guy. And it's like, okay, Quentin, we got it. You watched a lot of shit in the 70s and you're like, I could do it better. Okay, We got it. Radio. But I mention all this because the lead actor... Is it Louis Gossett Jr. or Louis Gossett Jr.?
I think it's Louis.
Okay.
That's how I've always understood it.
Yeah, I wasn't too sure. I watched an interview with him about this movie in particular, and he did reference Roots a lot in there too, just because of like prejudice and anguish and all of that kind of stuff, and like how those two different, like these two roles are very different from one another, but there's a lot of connective tissue there. So I thought it would be good to have you guys on to talk about it, because you ever actually seen this the lead actors in something before in one of your shows just by happenstance. You know, it's kind of a neat little thing. Like if we did this a couple years back when we first had you on, you'll be like, yeah, Louis Gossett Jr. from
I've heard of him.
Bodyguard, right?
right.
He won an Oscar for that.
We also were looking at the trivia we watched it on Amazon, and you can do like the trivia that pops up or whatever. And one of the pieces of trivia was also apparently that they shot a bunch of scenes with Peter Jurasik that didn't make it into the movie. So
from Babylon 5.
We almost had a double actor crossover, but it was not to be.
So let's talk about our histories and relationship with this. Bartek, do you have any relationship or history with Enemy Mine?
No, I probably have heard the name, but I'd never seen it.
Alan, what about you?
It's in that range of like it's an 80s like sci-fi, obscure sci-fi movie. So I've definitely heard the name at some point, but I knew nothing about this movie before you brought us on.
What about you, Magellan? Heard anything about it? Seen this before? Knew anything?
Not a thing. I was surprised to learn that the director also directed the film Neverending Story, which I haven't seen, but I would see like trailers for it on VHS tapes a lot when I was a kid.
Weirdly enough, I can see that this is the same guy who directed that movie. Yeah, I can.
It makes a lot of sense, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, kind of. So I recommended this. I have a big history with this. I've mentioned this many a times on the podcast, but my family are very much into science fiction. If it's sci-fi, they've watched it, probably. Whether it's good or bad. And if it's bad, they always give it the benefit of the doubt of, it's sci-fi, Ryan.
The Space Fury.
Yeah, like, here's a shitty straight-to-video movie called Space Fury. It's got space in it. And I'm like, okay. Or like stuff like that. And Enemy Mine is one of those ones that we've always come back to. When it came on DVD, we got it because it just is such a interesting little like, what I like about this is it's just a small corner of what could be a fascinating sci-fi world. We're just seeing one story in this big sci-fi landscape that you could explore bigger, but they decided instead of being a Star Wars, let's scale it down to just two people on opposite sides. And obviously, as a Star Trek fan, it has major ripples of stories I've seen in Star Trek done, weirdly enough, after this movie. There's an episode of Star Trek in which Geordi LaForge, just to go back to him again, he is trapped on a planet that is hostile with storms happening. They're trapped in a mine together with a Romulan who hates him because he's like, you're a stinking human and I don't trust you, and you're blind. You're useless to me, because his visor doesn't work because it got broken. And they have to overcome their bigotry and hatred of one another and escape the planet. And it's like, I've seen this done, weirdly enough, after Enemy Mine. So I've grown up with this movie. I've always had an infatuation with it. I love the characters. I love the music. I love the tone of the movie. I love how it's unapologetic in all of the ways. Like, it's unapologetically nice. It's also unapologetically violent. It's also, like, it's weirdly, like, it's just matter of fact in what it is in all of these varying ways. The makeup, of course, is always something that sticks with you. Like, the alien design of the Drac, which I will get into the name of that in a second, is iconic to me. It's just like, how did that not win an Oscar? If it didn't, I don't think it did. I didn't see any.
No, I think that was an iconic snub of the film, yeah.
Like, how could you not? Like, I was blown away. There was this one shot from behind Jerry's head in which you see, like, the back of his head and you see these veins, these little red veins on the back. And, like, such attention to detail, because most of the time we're not seeing the back of this guy's head. But you do every now and then, and it's there. It's like, beautiful. So I recommended this. I thought, you guys are a fan of sci-fi. Bartek, you're not really into sci-fi as much, but you kind of like these slow burn character study films. So I thought we could all benefit from talking about this, but what really spurred me on to talk about this movie, to get these guys on, to get the Chatz on, is recently Alan was going through the King Kong Godzilla cinematic universe that we're going through.
Yeah, true.
And do you know why I picked this movie, Alan, by me just saying that?
Well, not off the top of my head. What's the connection?
So, in Kong Skull Island, spoiler alerts a bit for Kong Skull Island, one of the things that most people who've seen that movie universally agree upon is John C. Reilly is really good in that movie. Surprisingly so. And his whole entire story is, it opens up with him as a young man who's a World War II fighter pilot shooting down a Japanese World War II fighter pilot, and they crash land on Kong Skull Island, and then you don't see them. And then it cuts to the 70s and you're with our main crew of characters, and then you go to Kong Skull Island and there's old John C. Reilly, and he tells us this magical story about how he and the Japanese guy had to survive together. They learned each other's culture, they became the best of friends, and they survived, and then the Japanese guy got killed. And everyone who I've ever met who's watched that movie have said, I would have liked to have seen that movie. I would have liked to have seen their story. And I've always went, that movie exists. It's called Enemy Mine. And
that's actually really fascinating that you mentioned that. No, sorry. It's I definitely see the comparison. There aren't a lot. This definitely feels like it's a movie that's happening in the background of a bigger movie, if that makes sense.
Exactly.
It's very personal in that way, and it's like these private interiority of these men's lives for, I think it's 3 years they reveal at the end.
Yeah.
And you see them come out of it, like John C. Reilly's character in Skull Island, and you're like, what happened to you? Why are you the way that you are? That your first instinct in the case of this film is to like choke the first guy you see because he's trying to steal your precious necklace that you got from your best friend. But sorry, I interrupted your point.
No. I wanted you to discuss, because you've seen Kong Skull Island, and now that I bring this up, do you see where I'm coming from this? Because I've met so many people who are like, Kong Skull Island's a fun movie, but those two main characters are like vanilla white toast boring. I would have liked John C. Reilly to be the main character. I would have liked to have seen that story with John C. Reilly, and I'm like, it exists. It's called Enemy Mine. It's just more sci-fi. It exists. Yeah. So,
well, I think the Skull Island, because it's trying to be so many things. It's like,
yeah.
Well, what part of this do you like? Do you like the generic Brie Larson and Thomas Hiddleston being smart and like irregular and just really stoic? No one cares about that, but that sells well on posters. Do you want to watch a bunch of like Vietnam sexist soldier boys like die horribly? I kind of do. That guy gets thrown against the cliff real good, Ryan. And
Shea Wiggum, that great actor Shea Wiggum, yeah.
The Shea Wiggum scene is the reason I watched the trilogy. And also I'm going to see Kong versus Godzilla in a week from now.
But that's the thing. That's like, it's a big blockbuster movie. You can't have this type of movie in that cinematic universe. You can't have Enemy Mine try to be an entryway into what is Godzilla will punch King Kong in the face. But that doesn't matter. When people watch that movie, most people agree John C. Reilly is like the emotional heart of that film. And it's like, wouldn't we like to see his story? And I'm like, guys, it exists. And we're going to talk about it today. Enemy Mine. Bartek, what did you think of this?
So I'll just say on top of that point, I remember a few weeks ago you were telling me about this, and I don't remember the Enemy Mine point, but when I was watching this film and I didn't know what it was, as soon as the spaceships hit each other and they were crashing onto the planet, I thought to myself, oh, I think I know what this is. I think this is that thing Ryan said, I want to see that film. And of course, when you said last week that you picked a sci-fi film, I'm like, okay, so it's going to be close to your heart.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what did you think?
I enjoyed it. I was a little tired while watching it, so I probably missed some points, but the general gist of it, it all went through my head, not over my head, through it. So it's in the brain. Same time. I enjoyed it a lot. I thought it was very, like you said before, unapologetically genuine.
Yeah, that's it. It's a genuine. It's like, what I like about this movie is someone had a story to tell, and they told it. There's some issues I have, namely the third act, but it's genuine. Like, someone sat down and said, this is a story and a universe and characters I want to explore in a film, and somehow we're sitting here and it happened, at least for you and myself. What did you think about this, Magellan?
I really, really enjoyed this film. I mean, it's obviously pretty. It's got some camp to it, which I think could put people off, and some, hard sci-fi-ness. But it ended up handling the whole "we're from two different worlds, we're two different races" thing a lot more responsibly than I was expecting it to. So yeah, I ended up really loving this film.
What about you, Alan? What did you think of Enemy Mine?
It's a humble film, like you were saying. It's a kind of a bummer that they don't really make movies like this anymore, because I got a lot out of it. I found it really engaging. I think I was saying to Majan before we started recording, this with a modern day budget as like a independent film would do great. People would love it. I think one of the biggest reasons that it was such a cinematic bomb at the time was, it's going against Rocky IV. It's the same. Rocky. They came out the same month. Yeah, but which grossed 10 plus times this film, and audiences might have not been coming to it for this relatively slow meditation on our differences and bigotry in 1985. That just wasn't what people wanted, and what action there is. Like you were saying, the violence in this movie it's not exciting and thrilling. It often happens it's almost mundane. I also have problems with the third act. I think it starts to get violent just for fun, just for 80s silly fun there. But even there, a guy takes a spear to the neck, and that just happens. And they're like, all right, we're moving on. A guy took a spear to the neck. You don't need to watch the blood flow like it's Zack Snyder, or you don't need to watch the guy scream. He dies, and you move on, because death happens in this world. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting is you said a movie like this couldn't be made today, and I agree, but not fully. A movie like this wouldn't be made today as a sci-fi movie. This movie would be done as a gritty, real-world drama in which Jeremy Renner walks into the reservation of a Native American people and says, I'm going to solve a crime here, and I don't like you guys. That's a real movie, by the way. I'm forgetting what it's called, but that's a real movie. And that's what it would be recontextualized. It would be recontextualized into literal real world context instead of the sci-fi nature. And look, I love sci-fi, but I think some modern sci-fi stuff like Star Trek Discovery, like Star Wars, so on and so forth, as time has marched forward, they're forgetting that you can use sci-fi as an allegory for real-world issues. Instead, it's just kind of yeah, look, Kylo Ren kind of represents a Nazi, but also, don't you love him? And it's no, not really. Not really.
He's a tall, cute boy. Yeah.
Not really. He's a bad man, but don't you want him to be redeemed? Yeah. I'm no,
right.
no,
not really.
But I think that's kind of missing in the world of sci-fi, but there's a discussion to be had there of when I walked into this movie with my wife, she had not seen it before either. She didn't know the plot, and when it started, she just looked at me, and before you meet Jerry, she said, "Oh, is this going to be a communist allegory? Is this what this movie's going to be about? The enemy that's a big empire, blah blah blah." And it's and I looked at her and I said, "No." I just think it's, and I don't want to say too much, but I think it's just generalized bigotry and fear of the other. It's not necessarily like Star Trek where it's and the Romulans are the Romans in space, or they are the Klingons, they are those evil Russians. To me, it had a more of a generalized feel. You could see a little bit of everything in here. I personally got indigenous people vibes as well, especially with them being they're dwelling on the land and all of that, but also obviously you've hired a black man to play this role, and
a man who very famously played an enslaved man in Roots, right?
Yeah.
And there's the imagery of the Drock being forced to work and being whipped, and that's very much in the film
at the antagonistic
well.
mine.
Yeah.
Right.
God, but
they know what they're doing. But I think the part of the reason this movie doesn't feel too dated is exactly like you're saying. They're not it means this. It is very open to interpretation. It's arguably a little safe because of that, but I think that is definitely to the film's benefit that they didn't choose to say anything more explicit about it. It occasionally, it's them yelling about exactly like you're saying, indigenous arguments about indigenous people's rights, and oh, well, you also conquered this as well, and Americans conquered this, and we're all imperialism stretches beyond just like the white man.
Yeah, I mean, we know we're in Australia where it's still like a current thing. It's like we're still proudly a part of the Commonwealth. But I wanted to discuss this issue here, which is some people hate, some people love, and some people feel indifferent about the idea of using sci-fi to be so allegorical about race and just generalized issues of these matters. Like, I've met people who are like, I hate it that, say, just to refer to Enemy of Mine, no one said this about Enemy of Mine because I've never met anyone who's ever watched this movie outside of myself, but just to say, some people would say, oh, it's so, like, gross and pandering and racist that they've hired this black guy to be, like, this enslaved race and blah, 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 blah. All that kind of stuff. But then you have the opposite end where it's like, well, if they hired a white guy, well, then obviously it's unfair because they're making an allegory to this and you're a coward if you don't do this. And then there are people like, I don't like sci-fi that's allegorical to real-world issues at all.
I hate to break it to those people, but it's all like that. It's all there's nothing that's not like that. I'm so sorry to break it to you.
But, like, it's a tricky issue because Star Trek's had many people come under flack for a whole multitude of reasons. Like, the most iconic one that people, oddly enough, are divided on is there's the famous image of the race in Star Trek, the original series, where one half of them is black, one half of them is white, and they're angry against one another because, their bigotry comes from your right half is white, my right half is black, I hate you. That type of thing. And people look at that and go, that's terrible. Like, and one of them, people go, they should have hired black actors to play that role, and then, no, they shouldn't have hired this. And it's like, where do we all fall on this? Because I'm personally like, can we just be happy that we've got a sci-fi story? Like, I get it. Like, I get all these complex issues, but I'm just like, look, I get what the writers are getting at. And with Enemy Mine, I get it. I'm like, cool, Louis Gossett Jr., he plays it well, but, like, I can see people... I've seen this argument done many a times. What do you think about this, Bartek?
So, sorry, that you said a lot there. What was the central question?
Mainly just coming down to how do you feel about something like sci-fi, for instance,
right.
A high-concept genre, whether it be sci-fi, fantasy, so on and so forth, using real-world stuff like race for allegorical purposes and the issues that could come around from that.
Well, obviously, since I think I'm the one among this group who's not as big into sci-fi as everyone else, having become friends with you, Ryan, and hearing your stories about growing up with sci-fi and how much you love sci-fi, and all of the incredible detail in which sci-fi has been used to tell all these stories, it has, in my head, like, kind of actually given this genre a bit of an identity, because growing up, whatever I would see, like, Zathura or Star Wars or whatever, it would be this just kind of generic thing of like, oh yes, sci-fi just means a story that has
robots,
any sort of machinery or scientifically explained thing as, like, a visual spectacle or whatever. So actually getting to see a sci-fi film like this that does utilize things like that actually feels for me like I'm kind of seeing the world that you've described to me over the years. So I appreciate that I got to see a film like this, and that it touches on allegorical things like racism or bigotry in general, as you said, in this way. It feels fulfilling for me.
Yeah, what do you guys think about this? You guys have had to cover a lot of shows that hit a lot of different spectrums. Obviously, you guys talked about like lots of big real world stuff, whether it be done well like Roots or whether it be done terribly like The Newsroom, according to you, or Babylon 5 or Farscape. Like, where do you guys fall on this stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think the sort of performance of this film at the box office says a lot, just to your point, Ryan, about how people feel about a sci-fi film that is like without pomp and is meant to be this very grounded allegorical story. It did not do very well at all. And it was interesting to see a film that is clearly drawing on a lot of the visual trappings of Star Wars. Like the opening feels very Star Warsy. The human ships feel Star Warsy. Even the planet feels a lot like Dagobah, specifically at times.
Yeah.
But it was interesting to see that. But then for the substance of the film to be a lot more specific in, I think, what it is allegorically trying to do, as opposed to Star Wars, where it's like, I guess, George Lucas was like, oh, the Empire is the United States and the rebels are the Viet Cong, and it's like a Vietnam thing or something. But it isn't really super deliberate about communicating that to the audience to the point where people can just watch Star Wars and like not even see that. And I think this is a film where you can't help but see the allegory that they're going for.
Yeah.
And when you do that, you run the risk of it ending up being kind of pat, like, oh, isn't it bad that people discriminate and shouldn't we get along, can end up being a pretty, kind of rote story. But I do think that the way that this film uses the sci-fi elements to twist and surprise you with the particular beats that the story goes on, I think ends up making it work. But you do have to sort of like be on board with it being an allegorical experience, because that's what it is. I don't think that there's much pure sci-fi fun to this movie besides the ways in which it services that story.
Yeah. I want to jump in briefly. I don't know how much value there is, because we're 4 people on this podcast who at least relatively enjoyed this movie. And how much value there is in like bringing up the straw man argument that like some people don't think that sci-fi should have a message. I almost don't even want to entertain a thought like that, because I think that this film does it. We all agree, like, has a message. We're not all very different. It's pretty simple, but like I said, it succeeds in doing that small thing of like, our languages are pretty similar and we can learn from each other by talking, and empathy is important. We save each other's lives, and we all have the same background. We have families, we have, food and culture. These are things that are shared amongst everyone. This is useful to the average viewer in the 80s, and I think it works for that. And like I said before, to say that any science fiction or any fiction, to be honest with you, doesn't have at least some sort of message that you can read into it is very immature and kind of like puts down the genre as a whole. To say that it's just like, oh, some of it doesn't mean anything, you can't look into it. I don't agree with that.
Yeah, I've just been thinking about it a lot, because I've been engaging a lot of sci-fi discourse lately, and just lots of differing topics, and it's like especially prevalent in sci-fi and fantasy genres because they are so heightened. And there's always that thing, right, with genres, like comedy is looked down upon in comparison to dramas. Like, oh, comedies can't hit you as hard because they're just trying to make you laugh. It's like, have you watched Planes, Trains and Automobiles? That fucking makes me cry every time.
Ugh,
but you know what I'm saying? Like in sci-fi, you guys have covered it. Sci-fi, fantasy, all these things. There is a level of, oh, that's just for niche people, and there's this level of animosity towards it. And like for people like Bartek, main sci-fi stuff is very pulpy, generic. Like doesn't always hit as hard as it could. That's why people like Star Trek, for instance, because it really does hit the nail, does really hit the nail there. Like, it really does go for full sci-fi as well as all the messages and whatever. Like,
yeah, for a bit of extra context, like, growing up, my mum, whenever the topic of sci-fi would get brought up, she would always say, like, oh, I'm not into that. The only ones I like is, like, Terminator. That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Bartek's mum is a film aficionado. Hence, she's going to watch Freddy Got Fingered very soon. So,
masterpiece.
Yeah, I just want to bring this up because it is one of the things where, I've seen people talk about movies like this in which it's like, oh yes, and the black guy is the alien and he's the other. And it's like, okay, like, I get it, but then, you have others that would complain, oh, well, they didn't get a person, and it's like, okay, guys, can we just watch the movie? Like, what Alan said, are you going to get all these messages or not? Like, it's just, like, and at the end of the day, it's just like, what I come down to it, too, is, did Louis Gossett Jr., for instance, how did he feel about it? He loved it. He still talks about this character all the fucking time. He wishes he could still play him. He does the voices at conventions. Like, he fucking loves this character. It's like, he's happy. So there you go, like, it's that type of thing. But I love this movie. I think it's an interesting idea, like what Magellan was talking about. It takes this kind of like veneer of like, oh look, it's a Star Warsy thing. Look, people are flying around in spaceships and they're cackling when they kill other people and fist pumping, and it's like, yay! That very American attitude of like militaristic value of like, yes, I've taken a life for my patriotism, yes. And then the movie's like, guys, that's actually pretty bad. That's actually pretty gross. And the film's like, let's explore how gross that is.
Well, even like before that, you had the opening narration, and as soon as it mentioned the thing about the was it the Dracs?
Drac.
As soon as it mentioned the Drac arguing for their squatters' right, I knew that like, oh, okay, they're not going to be like totally bad guys.
Earth is shit in this universe, and that's one of my big ticks for sci-fi. Earth is shit. That's why I love Babylon 5, because Babylon 5 is just like, does that thing where it slowly reveals to you that Earth is pretty shit, but then when you rewatch it, like, oh shit from the beginning, honey. But
Yeah.
I think what this film does well about this what you're saying, Ryan, about criticizing the problems of Earth's like space imperialism is it really makes you track that entire train of thought through the eyes of Dennis Quaid's character, Willis Davidge, because it's like he spends all this time marooned on the planet with Jerry, and then he ventures off to go look for signs of help or whatever. And there's this moment where he comes across the evidence of humans like strip mining the planet, basically. And it's just these like, you almost wouldn't look at them yourself, but these innocuous seeming remnants of a mining operation, but they're treated as like this horrific thing. And he sees it that way. And then he sees the skull of the Drac that's been killed by those humans. And I think it's moments like that that really speak to what this movie is good at, which is immersing you in the world and the logic of Willis Davidge specifically as a character, and seeing the way that his worldview is changing through the way that the camera starts to look at things in different ways. And then, you know, once you finally see like humans again, suddenly they're like the ugliest, scariest humans that you've ever seen in your life, because your whole perspective on humanity and Earth has completely changed along with his.
yeah, you get a sign early on that the movie is going to subvert this beginning, right? Because at the beginning, if you don't know what this movie's about, you're like, oh, it's a typical sci-fi thing where they're shooting the bad guys and cheering and being like, yes, we just murdered other people, and then they're
and
really
making like quips with each other.
Yeah, quips, and the music's all jaunty.
Fat
and,
woman.
and the fat lady, and then like when one of theirs gets killed, it's like, how fucking dare they? And they take a solemn moment, and it's like,
Yeah.
like you said, Magellan, it's campy, but that specific moment's campy by design, because it's leading you down this road of like, oh, it's a Star Warsy adventure. But what really touches me is when he crashes on the planet and he drags the other guy out, and the other guy's like dying. His like dying wish is just like, stop making fun of her. You know, she doesn't. She doesn't like it.
Right.
And I like.
So Magellan actually called out that line a little bit later, like pretty early in the movie, was like, oh, this movie is about him like understanding that the world is changing, and it's about people learning to empathize. Because again, placing this in 1985, you got to remember where America is at and what we're worried about. And this movie is telling you, oh, like jokes like that about like a woman's weight and a woman being like sexually promiscuous, what have you, are getting old fashioned. This is the movie telling you like, hey, in 2092 or whatever, we're kind of like moving past that. Like let's be a little bit mature here and empathize and understand that she's a person too. And then later when we meet Jerry, it's like, oh, well, he's the bad guy, but actually, aren't we also the baddies? You know, like that classic that clip from the
Mitchell
whatever
Webb.
that show is.
Yeah.
Mitchell Webb, yeah. You know, it really is like grabbing the viewer by the shoulders and saying, we're all people. Like, we're all going to die. We need to grow up together, or we cannot subsist. We cannot progress as a society, even in the far-flung future of 2090, whatever, unless we learn to listen to each other and understand each other. It's very strongly suggesting that, like, you got to come together, guys. We're going to die.
Yeah, and, you know, that line from I'm forgetting that character's name off the top of my head, like the younger guy who's dying, like, it's also like what holds this movie up is the performances, right? Most of the performances are top notch. Our main hitters are really hitting it out of the park, and even this guy is like a small minor bit part when he's dying there, and he's just like basically pleading with him, stop being cruel. I felt for him. I'm like, oh fuck, this guy was this guy was a person. Because before that, in the scene where they're flying around and doing all the quips, they're characters. Like, they're sci-fi characters, and they're just doing their shooty, and they're quippy, and he's the young guy who doesn't know he's in over his head, but then he fucking dies. And he's like, in his dying moments, he's like a real person who like wants, needs, and desires, and a viewpoint.
And you would expect that character, the stereotypical version of him, to say, like, tell Linda I love her, or whatever. But instead he's like, stop calling Linda names. And just the little twist of that and the little surprise of that is, as we're saying, a pretty essential, like, thematic statement that the film is making of, like, this is what this movie is about.
Yeah.
I feel like an idiot. I thought that was a woman.
No, it's a guy.
Okay.
No, it's a guy. It's just 80s hair, Bartek.
Right.
Yeah.
Talking about gender, oddly enough,
I love it. I love this.
I always knew that this movie was like, oh, Jerry is like non-binary. You know, they've got no gender really. They got like Jerry,
asexual reproduction.
yeah, and gives birth and whatever. But I forgot until watching it now in a modern context and realizing we're going to be talking about it in a podcast. I was like, I'm going to note down if they misgendered this alien and call them it. They refer to Jerry as an it throughout the movie, by him or and the most you get is like calling Jerry a mother. And Jerry's like, I'm not a mother. And it's like, okay, pregnant people then. Moves on. And I'm like, the film actually very consistently managed to stay in line with itself in that regard. Like, even though our main character is bigoted, there was no real moment where he's like, you man alien, blah, blah. He's like, well, the Drak, they have no gender, so we're going to abide by that. It's an it, which at first is used as a derogatory statement in its own right, where it's like, it's an other, it's an alien. But then as it goes along, it's just like, no, that's their pronouns. And then I really like the touch of, they're referred to as just a parent. There's no mother, father, all that, just parent. And it's like, oh yeah, your parent, was my friend and all that. And I thought that was really interesting. I wasn't expecting it to actually be that with this. I was expecting like, oh yeah, they're going to make jokes or whatever, or there's going to be this. But like, you watch a movie from 1985 where there's a non-binary alien and they treat it respectfully, which fucking Star Trek Discovery can't even do in the modern day. So,
well, this movie ends up being, I'm sure Michonne's going to say something similar to this. It kind of ends up being 3 movies, because you could end it on, like, Jerry and Willis learn to live in harmony, and then one of them dies when finally they get picked up by a search party, and it's sad, and we learned about empathy. And then the second one is, like, Willis picks up Jerry's child and delivers him to the people, but, someone has to die, That's, like, where each of these acts could end. But he's just, like, reluctantly survives both of those parts, and then Act 3 he's like, I don't know why I'm alive anymore, I just want to find this kid and go home, like, all of this is fake anyways. He's fully disillusioned and in like 80s action man mode, which I enjoy, but I think it's very silly.
Well, it was kind of like a reversal of what he was at the beginning, right? Like at the beginning he was like the normal action man at the end, but then at the end he's like, no, fuck this, I'm gonna shoot my way out of here and save the kid. Fuck this whole thing.
Yeah.
Right. It really threw me for a loop in the second act when it was like, oh, sure, Jerry's pregnant. Like, you buy into it pretty quickly, but I'm sure in the 80s, I'm going like, what in the world is this movie? This is too weird.
Right. Well, and when we were watching it together, Alan, both of us in that scene, because the way they lead into it is Willis goes to explore the planet, and Jerry's like, I can't go with you, and is a little bit cagey about it. And then Willis gets back, and Jerry's like, okay, the reason I couldn't go with you, and we were both like, say that you're pregnant. Say that you're...
We're like being funny. We're being cheeky.
Yeah, we're like, you're not actually going to say that you're pregnant right now. That's not what's going to happen. And the scene keeps building the tension to the point where Jerry's like, I am with child or whatever. Which for us, that was a moment of like, oh my God, I can't believe the movie just did that. And then the response from Willis in that moment is just joyous laughter.
Yeah.
Like I think what's really powerful about putting this movie in the sci-fi context that it's in is it shows you what it really looks like to have like radical empathy with another being. Like he's never seen a being asexually reproduce.
He's never even seen a Drac before.
He didn't even know that Jerry was capable of that. But he's so filled with joy because it's like, oh, it's a child of my friend. What a happy thing. And then to deliver the baby himself by plunging his hands into Jerry's guts and ripping him open is also this like incredibly powerful, well-acted moment that does so much more to communicate to you what it means to like truly cross that threshold of empathy than you could communicate in a story if they were just like two human beings going through the same plot.
What did you think about this, Bartek? I mean, this is a movie from the 80s. It's sci-fi inherently with stuff like Star Trek. They touch upon these social issues that we mentioned. Did you really expect that a movie from the 1980s is going to just proudly have a non-binary asexual alien that gives birth? And like, not even the give birth part, but just that alone. And like, you know, like we've actually been saying throughout this, like Jerry, and we've been saying he, but the movie never says that. They just call him it or they, and just Jerry.
Yeah, that would be one detail that I didn't fully take in. Like, obviously I got the whole thing of like, oh, they reproduce asexually. I think there was even a line about how they don't have men, women genders.
Yeah, and then voiceover, he's just like, they're the two genders trapped in one body. That was his base understanding.
It does lead to a weird moment where he's like, oh, it's beautiful that like the only time a woman and a woman human get together is to have a baby. That's so beautiful. And I was like, this is weird.
I'll talk about that. I think that's an interesting idea, and I think it makes sense for Jerry, but like, what did you think?
Of course.
So, continue on about it.
Yeah, before he had the line where he was like, just showed up, he showed the belly and he was like, oh, you're pregnant. He said something about, he had a variation of like caring for two or something. I'm like, oh, pregnant, wow.
Yeah.
So it didn't hit me as big of a surprise during the line, but yeah, it was very interesting. Yeah, I really didn't consider that, I guess because you were rewatching it, so you were looking out for it. Yeah, that whole thing of, they had a consistent script with regards to how they reference him. They never say he or whatever.
Him, yeah, they do it and it mainly, and then parent and stuff like that, which is great. And then even then, like they follow it up too from the very beginning of like, well, they don't have any kind of sexual reproduction organs or that. And when we first meet Jerry's fully naked, running around, and it's just like smooth because they're a lizard, fish, frog, toad thing,
amphibian.
And it's just like, oh yeah, of course they're going to do that because it's a 1980s movie. But then even then, like internally within the movie, it's like, well, of course they don't have genitals or external genitals or anything. Of course it's going to be like a smooth. Like, of course it all makes sense. Like it all adds up. I was really blown away by that. Like, I wasn't necessarily looking out for it on the watch, but I knew it was there, and then I was just like, oh, well, we'll see how it goes. And then I was paying attention. I'm like, they're staying consistent with this. And again, like, you know, there's some modern sci-fi stuff. I just slam Star Trek Discovery. Star Trek Discovery is a non-binary character, and they just don't know what to fucking do with them. And they just don't. They start the whole show with it's like, oh, and she's a her, by the way, and then randomly it's like, oh, I'm actually a them. It's like, well, why didn't you start out like this? Enemy Mine managed to figure that fucking shit out.
Yeah, it wasn't tokenism.
But yeah, I thought it was an interesting idea. Obviously, we've all gravitated towards the Jerry gets pregnant thing. It's interesting.
I mean, how can you not?
I mean, it's cool. I think it's just cool. Because in sci-fi, it's like a lot of it is aliens. Aliens are just like us, except for they're fish people, or they have like bumps on their heads. But like this movie's like, no. We're gonna take it to more of that. We're gonna say they don't have a gender. They're gonna say that they only have 5 names in their family lineage. We're gonna like they keep adding on to these details that make the Drac feel like a real species that exists. Hence it feels like there's a bigger universe going on inside of, like, that's outside of this little story. So the idea of like they don't even get to choose. It just happens. One day you just become pregnant, and it seems like from their societal standpoint, that's a joy. It's not like it's a burden. Even though they're at war right now, it doesn't seem like, oh, and then you fall pregnant, what a terrible... Like, you know what I mean? It feels like they celebrate life, which is obviously very much what Jerry's whole thing is, and like when they get into the rituals and the family lineage and stuff, like life... Family is very important to the Drac, who have been represented for a majority of the film as the alien other.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that you get with the Jerry character, like the two very different allegorical elements of, like, you know, the male warrior who fights and is, you know, seems very aggressive and
a wolf
masculine.
type, yeah.
And then once you get into the pregnancy stuff, you see this, like, a lot of, like, motherhood conventions from the character that, like, changes it up, but is still like the same person that we've seen develop.
Yeah, and Louis Gossett Jr. plays it so perfectly. It doesn't feel like, oh, and now I'm playing it femme or anything. Like, it feels so consistent. Like, we gotta talk about it. He's the best part of the movie, right? Louis Gossett Jr. Is he?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
By far.
Yes,
By far.
yes.
Country
Yeah.
Mile. I will say Dennis Quaid's like goofy ass, like American ass man character. It didn't get annoying on me the way it does with a lot of characters of that type. But no, Louis Gossett Jr. is acting.
Well, Dennis
circles around
Quaid
me,
just
that's
has
correct.
like a realness to him. I personally like Dennis Quaid. I know some people don't as an actor. I do. He's just one of those guys. He's one of the few people, unlike Kevin Costner. I don't believe Kevin Costner as a blue-collar guy. I believe Dennis Quaid as a blue-collar... Like, I could see Dennis Quaid just driving a regular-ass car and just walking over and grabbing a beer. Like, he feels like a real... like, dude. And that's why in this movie, where you're in a heightened sci-fi world where he's playing the machismo man who has to become a real dude, it feels real because Dennis Quaid's strength is just he feels like a guy who's just happened to fall into Hollywood. I mean, it makes sense. His brother, his older brother, Randy, like 4 weeks into being in Hollywood, got nominated for an Oscar. So, like, you know... Yeah, but like, yeah, Dennis, like Louis Gossett Jr. He's the main appeal of the movie. What about you, Bartek? What did you think of Louis Gossett Jr.? I imagine you're not too familiar with him. And what did you think of his kind of performance underneath all of this makeup?
Yeah, I'm not familiar with him, so this was a very real treat. Yeah, he's the most multifaceted character in the film. Like I said earlier, you know, starts off this really aggressive guy. Character. Even on the poster, there's this just antagonistic kind of thing where they're looking at each other, and it's clear that the title is referring to the fact that they are each other's enemies at the beginning.
Not there's a mine in it that's an enemy.
Do you know the trivia about that, by the way?
We do. We'll talk about it. It's stupid.
Yeah.
When you first
I just read it before we started.
when you picked the film, I had it in my head like, oh, I'll make a joke that I thought the title was about like an explosive mine. But then when I read the trivia and it was like, oh, the other meaning was like it was a mine owned by the enemy. I was like, oh, that's even dumber than my idea.
Yeah. Yeah. It's stupid.
It's also it's a play on my enemy.
Yeah, it's a possessive.
Yes.
It's a great title, but like the studio was like, no, you're going to put a mine in there where you have a fight scene at the end, and it's stupid. It doesn't even make sense.
Perfect explanation for why the fight scene at the end is so weird and out of place. It's like, well, we needed a mine, and the movie was basically done.
Wait, is that what happened?
That's what happened.
Yes, that's why it's
literally the studio said the audience will not get why it's called Enemy Mine unless you put a mine in there.
That's so stupid.
A mine owned by the enemy.
A mine owned by the enemy, who are the humans at that point.
Yep.
I was not, when the mine showed up, I was not like, oh, good, the mine.
Same here.
What?
That's why I've been calling it the antagonistic mine this whole time.
Yeah, I thought you were coming up with that joke, Bartek. I didn't.
No. The joke is Hollywood. So,
Oh my god.
you know,
enemy mine.
I love Louis Gossett Jr. as an actor. I've seen him in quite a few things. I think I should see him in more. He's one of those, even though he's an Oscar-winning actor and he's in Roots and all these acclaimed things, I still think of him as an underrated actor in a lot of ways. Like, I don't feel like people talk about him a lot in the caliber of, like, great actors because there's just something about him. He has just such a presence. He's just, like, warmth.
I think what he's really great at is leading the scene from the supporting actor role in it. Like when he's in Roots and he's Fiddler, he's really setting the tone of the interactions that Fiddler and Kunta Kinte are having with each other, because he plays a somewhat similar role to this film, where his character is sort of engaging Kunta Kinte's hostility and going with him through this arc of like having a more nuanced understanding of the world. Obviously those nuances are different between that and this, but like if you think about it, all of Dennis Quaid's emotional shifts in this film are following the example set by Louis Gossett Jr.'s character. Any sort of moment where he's like being a little bit softer or asking more questions or whatever, it's always Jerry who's initiating those things. And I honestly think that Dennis Quaid is doing as good of a job as he is in this film because he's like reacting to what Louis Gossett Jr. is.
And that's the thing with a film like this, it's easy for us to sit here and go, oh, Louis Gossett Jr. but they need both of them. They both need each other. Bartek and I know this as actors. One feeds off the other.
Yeah.
It's chemistry. Right. Simple as that. Like we've seen many movies with great actors paired up together, but they have no chemistry. There's no formula there, and it falls. Even though you know they're great actors, it can still fall. And like Dennis Quaid, yeah, like he's playing the typical protagonist role, and Louis Gossett Jr., like I said, his stuff is more interesting. He's feeding into the other character arc, but like Dennis Quaid has to play it a certain way for Louis Gossett Jr.'s alien character to be tolerable for the audience, because let's be honest, some people may not like this performance because it's really far out there. Like, let's not beat around the bush. It's a weird, like, so many weird choices, but they all feel like the right choice. Not just because of the direction, but because of how Dennis Quaid reacts off of him. Like, at first, Dennis Quaid's like, this is all weird, but then he becomes acclimatized to it. Like, one of my favorite moments from the movie visually is when we see Jerry in the rain. And he's, like, they're contorting their body all around in the rain, like, when they're near the little pond at the beginning, the little lake at the beginning, and all the rain's coming down, and, like, Dennis Quaid's standing there just like a normal person with the mouth open, drinking in the rain, while fucking Jerry is dancing around and all that. And then at the end of the movie, you see their home planet, and it's mainly water. And you're like, oh yeah, they're like water. So of course Jerry's reacting positively to this water, but it's like so weird and bizarre and alien. And of course it all makes sense. But yeah, the two of them need to bounce off each other. And that's why also the second half of the movie works well too, because Dennis Quaid and that kid, I think they have amazing chemistry too. I don't know if anyone else agrees, but that kid, he was great. And they both bounced off each other really well. Like, that kid, unfortunately, does become a stupid plot device at the end, but then I'll get into the third act. But, like, before that, I'm like, this doesn't feel like, oh, and it's the kid actor who they chose because they're cute or whatever. It's like they felt like they chose a kid who worked well with Dennis Quaid, and Dennis Quaid worked well with them, and they all matched up. Like, this is an acting movie as well as just a sci-fi movie. This is a movie you watch to appreciate actors honing in their craft and delivering it onto the screen. Louis Gossett Jr. obviously gets everyone's attention because he's just choosing all of the weirdest things. Like, Bartek, I know you have a harder time than I do with understanding different accents. How did you feel about it? Because he's doing this crazy voice. Did you find it, oddly enough, alienating?
I did struggle. I did struggle a little bit. I probably might have had a better time if I turned the volume up a bit more. But yeah, you get the points most of the time because, and this was something I wanted to bring up. An element that we haven't directly mentioned is that there's an early part of the two main characters' relationship is a language barrier that gets broken, and they have to at first work around that. And you have a little bit of a time skip where in that time skip they've relatively gotten each other's languages so that they can communicate effectively.
Especially Jerry. That's the most important thing.
Yes.
Jerry actively tried.
Yes.
And then Dennis later has to ask, okay, teach me the language.
Yes, because this film, if you look it up, the language is in English, so English is the one they have to focus on. Yeah, and as another, again, multifaceted, this is a representation of a character who is speaking English as an alternative language. And you get that through, not proper grammar. And you get a little bit of characterization in when you hear what he says. It's all in the context of our main character, Willis, right?
Yeah, Davidge.
Willis Davidge.
Ugly head.
Anything that Jerry is saying, it comes from the context of Willis taught him that. So hence the Mickey Mouse reference is like what was that film?
I don't know. You're thinking. Bartek's using his thinking face.
Golf ball, garden hose.
Bartek is loading.
Full Metal Jacket.
Full Metal Jacket.
Like they sing the Mickey Mouse song at the end. It's like, this American icon.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things that I find interesting too is my wife watched this and she said, of course, Jerry learns the language first because this has to be in English. But then as the movie goes along, I would say at least 25% of this movie is in the alien language. Like, there's just whole scenes in which they're just singing and talking and doing the vocalization of that alien language. And there's no subtitles, or at least on my copy there wasn't on DVD. And it's just like, there's at least like 10 minutes of this movie that is just Jerry's language happening. And that's kind of cool. And they spread it throughout it. So it's not just like obviously the film has to have it in English. Obviously Jerry has to, because we speak English. I mean, come on. Could you imagine if you know what that movie is? The Star Wars Holiday Special.
Oh, no. I thought you were going to tell your District 9 story.
I'll tell my District 9 story. So my good friend Zaki is infamous for downloading movies illegally and without subtitles. He watched District 9. And he said to me, I really like District 9, but it was a bold artistic choice that they didn't subtitle the aliens. And I just laughed. I nearly cracked a rib laughing. I died. And I said, no, Zaki, they do have subtitles. There's a whole story. And he was sitting there going, really? I thought it was an artistic choice to have the shrimps, the prawns just talk like that. And I imagine him sitting there watching a movie that's nearly 2 hours long and most of it is noises, and he's just sitting there nodding his head going, this is really interesting.
Wow,
I wonder what they're
amazing.
saying. Like, God.
And did you say this was happening like in the middle of a class?
Yeah, he was telling me this in high school, and I died, and then I told my teacher, Mr. McCauley. He walked over and he's like, Ryan, what's so funny? And I'm like, sir, have you seen District 9? He's like, of course I have. Of course I have. And he goes, and I told him, and he went, Zaki, really? And just walked away. And he's still infamous like that. Like, Zaki gave me a copy years back of what's that movie, Snowpiercer, where half of it's in fucking Korean and it didn't have subtitles.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and I grabbed my fist and I shook it in the air and went, Zaki. But yeah, I was just curious of what you thought about that language stuff, because I know you, Bartek, get a little tripped up on accents that are a little bit heavier. Like, Bartek and I have watched a video that's of an Australian man who's got like a what we call an ochre accent, which is just a thick Australian accent. And Bartek said, what language is this?
No,
like, it's English.
It's like when another character spoke in a much clearer accent, I was like, oh, this is in English.
Yeah.
And then I understood it.
Then he understood.
And I've rewatched that video and like, yeah, he's speaking English from the beginning.
But what did you guys think of the Drac language and the whole kind of culture that you kind of pick up as this movie progresses?
Yeah, I think it's interesting what you were saying before about the ways in which this movie makes the Drac more interesting than just like humans, but they're lizards. And I think that's definitely true. Like, there are science fiction elements that are just cool about them. The design is incredible. The biological information that we learn about them, the sound of the language is really unique. I think I wanted to know more about them because there were times where it kind of just felt like, oh, they're, at the end of the day, they're just the sort of nice, innocent other aliens and we shouldn't be so mean to them, which in and of itself can be a problematic way to tell this story. Like, if I were to criticize the film in any way, I think, since it ultimately centers the like white male earthling guy, it's about him. And so the Drac characters aren't really like having the emotional arc of the story.
When you say that Jerry does at the beginning, because he's just as hostile and just as angry as Dennis Quaid, but he's more willing to give over. Yeah,
that's true. I agree with that. And I kind of, I found it interesting. They were having one conversation at one point where they were fighting, like after they had this beautiful moment where they were talking about the Talman, and like, you know, be nice to other people. Then they get into like this fight where they choke each other when the meteor shower is going on, and they're kind of both arguing that they both have like imperialist claims to this region.
Yeah.
And I kind of wanted to see the version of the film where the Drakh are in some ways just as at fault for the things that they're doing as the humans are.
And that's the unfortunate thing of it being such a small story, because you do get glimpses, like at the beginning, the Drakh are the one that attack. The humans are flown along and they attack first. So it's like, you get little things, but that's the thing of, if this is a TV show, like Babylon 5...
Yeah, you get to explore that over more time.
You get to hear all about the Drakh on Babylon 5.
Yes, can we talk about that briefly, Bartek? You look
I know you want to.
In Babylon 5, there's actually quite a few things that's crossing over here. In Babylon 5, a show that came out several years later, I'm not saying that JMS watched this movie and subconsciously kept some information. I'm not saying that.
You're subconsciously
one of the most bizarre looking alien races is called the Drakh, and they're evil and they're weird, and it's the name, and it's like, okay, similar name, okay, I can let it go. But then also in Babylon 5, one of the main characters loves Daffy Duck, and one of the other aliens sees this Daffy Duck poster and he's like, who's that? And another character's like having to explain, and they explain Daffy Duck like this religious, spiritual icon.
He's the Mickey Mouse.
Right. And then obviously Earth is shit. That's the other thing that's also in common. They're very disparate elements, but when I watch it, I'm like, I've seen these things play out in similar beats before. So there's the little B5 reference for you out there, people. There it is.
I think Babylon 5 is an amalgamation of a lot of... JMS is a gigantic sci-fi nerd, and smushed together a lot of different sci-fi. So that definitely tracks. All those things you said, like... a pop culture figure is treated as like a weird godlike thing by the aliens or by the humans explaining them, or
and the aliens treated like it's very stoic. Like, I'm so sorry about what I said about Mickey Mouse.
Exactly. That's a joke I've seen before, but it is funny. But like the Drakh, that's a particularly like specific
name,
similar name, same name.
I think the last thing I wanted to say, just on that point about the wanting to know more about the Drakh culture, that I kind of think is a weird moment in this movie, is when you learn about the Drakh religion and the Talman, like the book that Jerry has around their neck. And all we learn about it is that they basically think the same stuff as Jesus, and that makes them worth empathizing with. And that was kind of an odd beat for me, where it seems like the big moment where, Willis is like, oh, we're not so different after all, is when he says like, oh, the human Talman teaches the same lessons, and Jerry says truth is truth and all that. And it's like, yeah, I guess so. But also it'd be kind of cool to just hear the philosophy of an alien society. And
yeah, it's weird that you went with the Jesus thing there. I really got with, especially the book, very Jewish type of vibes from his little Talman book that he had.
Yeah, I guess that's fair.
I think it's the whole point of every society, every culture has some form of spirituality or religion or something. And a lot of these religions, a lot of these spiritualities, a lot of these things hit a lot of similar beats. Yeah, they just vary on what they think, what you should emphasize on. But a lot of religions is about like, unity and peace and prosperity, and it's like, that's the truth through most of the religions. I didn't specifically see it as like a Jesus thing, because also I saw with the Drakh there, it felt like an amalgamation of like, there's some Sikh culture in there, there's a little bit of Hinduism here, there's a little bit of indigenous culture from this. I felt like it was a threading of a lot of things without being so specific. Like Star Trek, I love Star Trek, but it's like the Bajorans, they're just space Jews. That's all they are.
Right.
Well, this I felt like, again, it's vague enough, but also not too vague where you go, well, they're not saying anything. Bartek, you want to say something?
It's essentially what you guys were saying. Yeah, I remember there was an image that was going on around online a few years ago. It wasn't like super viral or anything, but it was basically this image of a bunch of different descriptions of what each religion really believes in, and they were all like basically the same thing in different wording. Like love each other, peace, things like that.
Maybe not Scientology. I think they have a different understanding of religion, but yes.
Yes, maybe them.
And especially Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam are remarkably similar, but different in important ways. So I think Magellan is more saying like the fact that the Drakh religion sounds so similar to just Abrahamic religion, like believes in a holy text, and which all of them do, and has like a Messiah, which all of them do. Like that part.
That's actually a good
felt
point.
kind of
Abrahamic religion.
Yeah. Well, and I think I do think that it's valid that it connects to all sorts of religious traditions, but I think that textually, Willis Davidge is making a connection to the Christian Bible, because the specific thing that Jerry is saying is this idea of if someone attacks you or is cruel to you or whatever, you show them kindness, and it's very much the like turn the other cheek Jesus thing. So that's at least what I was seeing there as the specific Christianity connection, but I think there is a sort of broader like golden rule thing going on there also.
Yeah, I mean, I still wish that I could see more of this universe. This is the only thing we're ever going to get. This is it.
Yeah.
But I wish that we could see more of this bizarre little sci-fi world, because there's something here. But again, that it comes down to we're just telling a really personal story, and the sci-fi-ness is there as table, it serves a bunch of functions, but really it's an aesthetic thing. Like a lot of sci-fi, like good sci-fi, you can still strip away the laser beams and the scales and the pregnancies and still have a coherent story. That's what makes some of the best sci-fi work. It's not just spaceships go boom boom in space and you go fuck yeah, like at the beginning of the movie, right? If the beginning of the movie was the rest of the movie, then we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it in the way that we are. What did you feel?
I have a point.
Oh, go on.
If I have like an overall takeaway from this movie, what it has to say about faith and what it has to say about empathy and all that is, we learn this from the way that Dennis Quaid's character learns it. Not only are we all the same, but we are the first step in making change. Us, ourselves, our current generation, because after learning, he has that whole line where he's like, the other Jerry asks him like, "Oh, what are your parents' names?" And he's like, "Oh, Carl and Dolores." And Carl worked for IBM, and Dolores was was whatever
waitress,
and a waitress. Thank you.
Before she got married.
And he's presented with right then and there. You no longer just get to be like, "Well, I had a great experience with a Drakh and I moved on." It's like, nope. You have to make one of the biggest decisions of your life right now and decide if you're going to change the world right now, which is the sort of call to action of this movie. This baby is going to be born. Are you going to pull it out of my stomach? And are you going to then bring it home, which is like the biggest peace offering to show the Drakh that like not all humans are bad. Empathy can be developed, and
could very much be a death sentence for Willis Davidge also. Like he doesn't have any assurance that if he goes to the Drakh homeworld, they won't just kill him when he gets there.
But by that point, he's already betrayed the humans to do this, so he's dedicated enough where that doesn't matter. Earlier in the movie, his whole point is we've got to go out and look for help because we're going to die. Like his whole thing is survival for a lot of it, right? We've got to build the house. We've got to do this. We've got to survive, right? And as he learns throughout the movie, you have to go beyond just being a survival person in these situations, or you will go crazy. Like, to refer to Babylon 5 a little bit again, but more so to Lost, there's a character in Lost who's played by Mira Furlan, who's just like a survival nut job. She completely, for most of it, it's been a while since I've watched Lost because I don't like it. When you meet her, she's insane, basically, because she's just had to survive. She's cut off personal ties. It's like, that's not the way to go, and Davidge kind of learns that when he could have been like, fuck Jerry, I'm just going to go on my own. But he promised Jerry he would come back, that he would come back. But then I also learned, but they're going to enslave Jerry. I don't want that. I'd rather die. Basically, he walks all the way back and just was like, we're just going to live here now. He gives up the foolish pursuit of escaping because death is more of a preference at that point than perpetuating the hatred that he was a part of at the very beginning of the movie. That's interesting to think about. Like, I was going to ask, how did we all feel when Jerry died? Because that's like that's a big turning point, right? You've now removed one of the two characters in the movie.
For all the listening people who have been hearing us talk up Jerry this whole time, he's in the first half of the movie?
Yeah, a little bit over.
The first hour, yeah.
Majority of the movie. What did you think of that, Bartek? I mean, Alan said this is the nature of the beast of these type of stories, but how did you feel? Did you see it coming? How did you feel about it when it did?
I didn't see it coming, but I liked the fact... I like it when you have a character that when they die, their presence, their legacy is still felt, and in this case it was, through the child and through our main character's development.
Yeah, I was going to say that's important through the main character too.
Yes. So when it happened, it surprised me because even just looking at the poster, you think like, oh, this is going to be the whole film. This is going to be just like that classic movie Tiger and Crane Fists where they're friends the whole time.
I remember as a child, and again, Magellan brought this up. This is by the same director of, was it the Neverending Story?
Neverending
And the most
Story.
famous thing about the Neverending Story is the horse, his friend the horse gets brutally murdered. And it's like really sad. As a kid, it really upset me when Jerry died because I felt like I lost a friend. When you get like so enveloped in movies, especially when you're a kid, you get attached. Mm-hmm. I was so fucking sad when Jerry went, and then I like the kid. I liked him as a kid as well, but like I was so sad. And as I grow up, I still have that sadness there of like I've lost a friend, even though it's just Louis Gossett Jr. in makeup from fucking nearly 40 years ago, right? Like, I still have that little thing in my heart where I'm just like, oh no, not Jerry. I wanted Jerry to make it. Even though, like, yes, Alan's right. Like, it's obvious, when you know these type of movies, when you know these type of stories,
somebody's going to
die. And that's the unfortunate beast of reviewing and breaking and analyzing things. You know these beats, but sometimes the emotions still overcome you knowing the structural beats of a story. And for me, this is one of those where it's still, my emotions still overcome the knowledge of how stories work, but also the knowledge of having seen this movie before. Magellan, you gonna say something?
Yeah, and I think what sort of makes this film rise above the structural like predictability of Jerry dying is it's not the sort of thing of your partner gets shot when they're one day away from retirement or something like that.
Yeah.
It's Jerry is fully knows that they're going to die and is actively choosing to go in this way or accepting it at least.
Yeah.
And sort of in the moment of their death is coaching Willis through how to deal with it and what to do next. And I think that just it ends up making even though it's a letdown that this incredible character who was half of the film dies halfway through the film, the way in which they die I think is really meaningful and ultimately allows for the character to die with agency over how that death takes place.
Yeah. It doesn't leave a bitter taste in your mouth. Like, I've seen some movies and shows where characters get killed or die, and it leaves such a bitter taste in my mouth where I go, they just did that for the drama of it, or they did this. But what you're saying, it's so true. Like, there's an ownership and an agency, and like Bartek said, yes, Jerry dies, but Jerry lives on through the people affected by Jerry, be through the child, through Davidge. Yeah. What did you think, Alan? I mean, like you said, you knew that this is kind of the beats, but did you still get touched?
Absolutely. Well, so I think one of the biggest successes of this film is I was thinking a lot when we were watching it about like where did the budget go? Where did they put the money in this movie? I think that's a really valuable thing to examine when criticizing a movie. Or when examining a movie, it's like, okay, well, they could have put the money into anything. Let's say they had an infinite budget. And it seems like primarily they did, a good model work and making sure all the space stations look really cool. I think there's like a YouTube essay about the hallway design of Enemy Mine, which is fascinating. Yeah. And like the set itself looks like, let's be honest, like a 60s Star Trek, like plastic rock set. But they really focused on like the characters and the like engendering empathy by like knowing how to focus on them and using parallel moments and parallel shots, like you were saying, where Jerry is like making faces at the beginning because of the rain. Like it almost and also on beautifully painted backgrounds. You know, it's not a very CG heavy movie. There's one major like creature effect, and it's the grabby guy that like is a recurring sort of menace to them.
Love that guy. Love that guy.
He's a friend. That's a friend for sure.
No,
I hate that
he's an enemy. You tried to kill Jerry.
Yeah.
I just remembered one little
He's
giggle.
kind of an enemy mine, actually. He's an enemy mine, and no, my point being that like they do such a good job making like these characters that I almost could have watched this as just a play. Like, give me the intro in 5 minutes in like text or something, or in a narration, and there is narration in this movie, and then just give me 2 actors in costume. Like, you know, the Drock have to have the fingers so that the 3 and versus 5 finger scene happens. But other than that, this is 2 people talking. I love movies like this.
Yeah.
I love Babylon 5 because it's people talking in a room and it's very little like shooty alien.
Yeah.
That's the shit I come here for.
And when there is, until the 3rd act, we'll get to it. Until then, the action beats are progressing the story because they're not like shooty action. It's like, oh my god, the monster's got my leg. Here's close-ups of my leg and the skin falling off of it because it's ripping it so hard. I'm like, Jesus. I don't know if anyone else reacted like genuine like whoa to that, but even to this day, I was like, that's fucking brutal.
Yeah.
I was just trying to understand the mechanics of that because he eats the turtle thing and then like sheds its like whole body out of the shell. But when he just has a tentacle around Willis's like leg, it gets bloody as if it's literally about to be sliced off.
No, because it has prongs on its tongue. But when it that's how it grabs the turtle thing at the beginning. It stabs its prongs into it and then drags it down, and then eats it with its mouth. But the tongue has spikes and stuff on it to fuck you up good. Like, it's not just like a normal tongue. If you look at it, it does have jagged bits that would rip your flesh.
There are just moments of like surprise gore in this film that I end up being fine, but I was not ready for them. Like that moment, and then I guess we'll talk about the 3rd act. But when the guy gets like kicked into the like machinery, and you watch him get chewed up by it, and then someone is like brandishing his bloody ear later. It's like, yuck. I didn't know we were gonna do this.
Bartek, you said you had a giggle moment.
Oh yes. It's regarding the turtle thing. I think it's literally the very first shot you ever see of one of those turtle things is like it's a side shot of it walking, and then it like goes behind something, and it's clear that it's going down a hill. And then obviously in the next cut you see it's walking down the hill into the trap. But just before that cut, you can see that, like, because it's not CG, it's like an actual, like,
I want one
practical thing. You can kind of see it kind of fall over just before the cut.
Yeah.
And I had a Google at that.
See, people also get hung up with sci-fi movies. They think the budget means everything. That's the thing. I don't think so. Look, I grew up with Star Trek. I grew up with Babylon 5. I grew up with old school Battlestar Galactica. Doesn't matter sometimes. As long as you have compelling characters, a good story, and a theme that you actually want to explore, I can overlook the little turtle creature falling down before the shot ends, because also, it was cute. I want one. Can I have my little turtle Roomba creature? Please give it to me now.
Yeah. Ryan's hungry.
Yeah.
I'm hungry. I want to shoot it with an arrow, and then it runs away with my arrow. I'm like, give me back my arrow.
And then you chase
you
it.
Fucker.
You chase it by vaulting over a thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, he wanted his arrow back, because they're surprisingly fast, the little turtle things. But, before we get into the gruesome 3rd act, this movie's funny. I just want to make sure that people listening out there who haven't watched this movie's really funny. And not just funny, but fun. Like, we're dealing with a lot of brutal topics like bigotry and all this kind of stuff, but my wife said to me when she watched it, she just said, this movie's cute. Like, it's really nice.
Kind of, yeah.
And how did it... I can only speak for myself, but I'll ask this question generally. How did it manage to have these heavy things going on while still also coming across as a nice, fun, cute little movie? How did it manage that?
Strong chemistry.
Well, again, it's... All right, everyone else go ahead.
Bartek said strong chemistry. Magellan?
I think the scene for me that like fully communicates the sense of humor that the film is going for that makes it successful is when Willis is explaining his family lineage to Jerry and doing the stuff we were talking about before about, oh yeah, Dolores, my mom, Dolores was a waitress And then he's like, oh, and we used to go to my grandpa's farm, whatever. And then Jerry recites back to Willis the story of his family lineage. And it's like,
shit sounds boring.
Yes, Willis Davidge, born of Dolores, a waitress, and further back, grandpa.
Perhaps a farmer.
Grandma, perhaps a farmer. And it's like, and says like, sounds kind of thin or whatever. And there's just something about that where that moment is, you're not laughing at Jerry for not knowing, like, oh, his name's not Grandpa. That's a word, stupid. Like, that's not the joke. The joke is at Willis's expense, but also there's such a warmth in Jerry really trying to honor Willis and his family lineage in a way that we're like, it doesn't need to be that serious, but there's just something about like coupling that like kindness with the sort of funny misunderstandings of it, and also them poking fun at each other because of how intimate they've become.
Yeah,
that I think is at the heart of like why those things work. In this movie.
Relate. One of the things I find interesting too is I didn't even think a part of the humor was how he thinks their name is Grandma and Grandpa. I thought what I found funny, and this comes down to Dennis Quaid, his performance. He does not know. He takes so long to remember his own mother's name, Dolores. Like, there's this massive pause because he's like, I've never had to call her by her name before. I've called my dad by his name, probably. But, like, my mum is Dolores, and then he probably just doesn't know his grandparents' name. Like, I remember for so long I forgot my grandparents' name because they were just Nan and Pop, right? Like, you know, that kind of thing. And just, like, I got amusement from that. I remember one of the comedic beats for me that really sold me on the comedy of it is when they're arguing against one another again earlier in the movie, and Jerry is saying, you aren't worthy of learning from, I can't remember the name of the Messiah person, but because you disrespected them early in the movie. And then Dennis Quaid very sternly says, yeah, and do you remember what you said about Mickey Mouse? And Jerry instantly drops the antagonism and is genuinely sorry.
He's like, I didn't mean what I said.
And that makes me laugh because it's like, because we know what Mickey Mouse is. Well, Jerry doesn't need to be so apologetic, but it's also like, it's so sweet. Like, Jerry's like, you know what, I'm willing to say I'm sorry for that one, okay? Like, I didn't mean that. That was unfortunate. Yeah. And then that opens up Davidge to do the exact same thing.
As much as these moments are like comedic, like the Jerry sincerity, I think when I think of all those moments, I like get just like really impressed by how sincere and how meaningful he says all these things. Like it's a really big characterization moment. So like when he said that whole thing about like, you know, Davidge, son of blah 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 blah, I thought like, wow, he's recontextualized this kind of clumsy information he's been given into something like really genuine sounding, and then that plays into the very, very end of the film, the ending narration, where they kind of bring back that idea of like this is an important part of Jerry's culture, and they add Davidge to that. Yeah, like
Davidge made such an impact.
Yeah, that last line, it's like, and Davidge was added to his family history. It's like just the big as much as the third act has problems, like that was a really good ending.
That's a neat little bow on it. But Alan, what about you when it comes to kind of the levity and the humor of this? We've seen many a gritty, allegorical sci-fi things try to add their humor, Star Trek Discovery, and fail.
Right.
So what about it works here?
Well, it's believable. You know, it's not too Stranger in a Strange Land to the point where it's annoying. It's not like, oh my god, I get it, you guys are different and you don't agree with each other. Like, they get pretty quickly to the point where they're friends. Or not friends, but at least like begrudging allies. And then it did feel a little awkward going from that comedy into the storm scene where it's like, oh, now I hate you and I'm going to try and choke you and all this stuff. Where I'm like, oh, I guess we hate each other now. But like people act like that in real life. Maybe that's a weird edit, but that's also just sometimes people, even after getting along, can still fight. That's just siblings right there.
Yeah. But
this leads into talking about what I want to pivot to if we can. We keep mentioning the third act.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about it because, I don't have much more to say about the first two acts other than I deeply fell in love with both of these characters and really enjoyed the vibe of the world they were on. But, so Jerry dies. He gives birth to Zamis, his child, who Will tries to bring to the Drakh homeworld, but he's found. Zamis is captured by some human soldiers, and then
miners.
I believe
They were
we are
miners,
to
right?
right enemy miners. Will is presumed dead after getting shot and rolling down a hill really slowly. He wakes up. There's like a first-person coffin sequence, which is fantastic.
Oh, I love the humor in
And
that.
he wakes
that
up.
was so bleak. The music fucks up.
Yeah. They're like hit the thing. Like, God damn it, that was so super dark in a way I liked.
That felt like a Red
And
Dwarf
then
gag.
he wakes up. As soon as he puts his hand around that guy's throat, I'm checked out of the movie, because now he's just, and it's cool that he's like, I'm gonna save these miners, and it's like, cool, I respect this like workers' rights thing going on here. Like, you're treating them like you're literally, these are your slaves. This sucks. Let them be people. Let them be free. Where is my adopted son or whatever? But then it really is just like, here's 20 minutes of action for the folks. I was so checked out of this last part of the movie.
I check out personally once he gets back onto the planet, because I think there's actually quite a lot of interesting stuff on the ship, especially seeing his old comrades looking at him like no, that can't be the same Davidge. I mean, he hates those Drakh guys. He wouldn't speak their fucking language. I think there was something you could have explored there, but
a potential.
A fucking third act is, and here's, I've always said it, my biggest complaint about the movie is studio interference. This is a movie from a very young age. As a child, I looked at it and said, this feels like somebody meddled with this. Even as a child, I felt the overbearing presence of someone coming in, especially as an adult now, you don't need the narration, but that's very much a studio note. We need to have the narration. We need to have
Blade
that.
Runner, perfect example. You don't need the narration.
Yeah, especially with sci-fi things where you're giving them big, heady concepts. You need to spoon-feed them with a text crawl at the beginning or narration. You don't need that. But back then, they felt like they did, especially. And we still see that today.
Yeah.
And then the third act, we've already went over it a bit, which is you have to have a mine in the movie. You have to have someone to be punched. You have to have an action sequence. And it's not like any of the action sequences are done particularly poorly, but it's like, this isn't the movie we've been watching. This is a new movie. This is Tango and Cash. I can tell because the bad guy was the bad guy in Tango and Cash. For fuck's sake.
Oh, nice.
And he's also in Blade Runner as well, that guy.
Do we know?
Perfect.
Do we know what the original conception
story.
of the ending was? Or how does the short story end?
I can't remember what the original conception, because also there's lots of behind-the-scenes issues with this movie. Bartek, I'm sure, I don't know if you read any, but originally this movie was shot by a different director, and they weren't happy with it, so they got a new director to come in and redo the whole entire fucking thing. I wonder what that cut's like, because that's a film that was almost complete as well, so I wonder what that cut looks like. But,
oh, wow.
Yeah, there's a lot of behind-the-scenes studio interference, and apparently this is one of those movies, too, where it was going along fine, no interference, even with that stuff, and then it just went a little bit over budget, and the studio came in, looked at it, and said, what the fuck is this? How about you do this? How about you fix that? How about you add this? So I don't know necessarily what the original ending is. I think the original ending would have had to have still what we got at the end, which is he returns to the Drakh home planet and has a ceremony, but the in-between of that, I don't know, because also one of the things that Alan Miley brought up is the big important thing to reference is Davidge does not want to leave this planet. He's completely like, this is where we live now. Do not go there. They're bad people. But of course, child's curiosity leads to trouble. And it's just one of these movies where I just wish the third act didn't suck so hard, because it does drag this movie down from what I would consider a 10 to a good 7. Because this ending it's so inappropriate. But it's like, you had a big problem when we did Tango and Cash. You thought the ending to that movie was, even for an action movie...
Yeah, the beginning of the climax especially. Yeah.
The action, even for an action movie, you thought that felt really weird and out of place. How did you feel about it in this, where we've been talking so headily about all these things, and then later in the movie, you have the bad guy from Tango and Cash literally jumps off a platform to tackle Dennis Quaid because he just hates him so much.
Yeah, when we it's similar to what Alan was saying. When we think that Dennis Quaid is dead, and we have that
conveyor belt,
sequence. Yeah, I mentioned earlier a big plus for this film is that Jerry's legacy still felt alive. And the fact that you've seemingly killed the other main character, it's like, oh, I wasn't expecting this. So, like, how are they gonna follow up on this death? Like, I don't see where this could go, but can it be, like, as meaningful as that? And then when you have that, frankly, like, horror movie shot of, like, grabbing the throat, I literally thought, like, oh, this is weird. Like, in my head, what I was imagining was, like, oh, something happened on the planet to, like, give him a power or something to have survived that, and now he's, like, a monster or something?
Because it was a horror movie thing.
Because it was a horror movie thing, yeah, so...
In a non-horror movie.
And then the next time we see him, he's being operated on like he's sedate again, and it's like, oh, what's... The visual language of the film was confusing me.
Yeah, and then you get into the action. Again, I think the action is done very well. I don't think it's terrible, but it's like, it didn't belong in this movie. That's the thing. It's like, where did this come from? Like, and again, I can see on paper how this makes sense. I can see on paper, at the end, Dennis Quaid has to fight the enemy, which is his own people, to save someone who used to be his enemy. I can see that making sense, but it does feel like whoever was in charge of this had it taken away from them, and the studio just put in the formula, plug into all the different outlets, and here we go, we've got an ending. And it is just severely disappointing. Like, look, am I going to lie that I didn't say fuck yeah when the guy got ground up into beef and his ear got shot out? I'm not going to lie, I did enjoy that. That was fucking cool. But, like, did it belong in this movie? No, the arrow through the throat belonged in this movie. That made sense. But, like, I don't know, Magellan, what did you think? Especially now that you know the mine was added because studio said audiences are dumb. They need a literal mine in there.
It's just one of those things. I wish I could think of some examples, but I know that there are other films where I feel similarly, where the third act just feels like, okay, this has to end, so we have to do something. And for that reason, I felt very ambivalent to the third act here. There's like not anything new that happens, and I think it sort of furthers the critique I had before of centering Willis Davidge as a character, because he just becomes this like white savior guy. Yeah. And all of the Jock are like, thank you so much for saving us. You're the good one, right? Like, they're literally like, oh, your uncle. We heard about you. You're the cool human.
Cool uncle.
And yeah, so it was cool to see him like throw that guy into the shredder and see the other human workers be like, yeah, solidarity between workers and, you know, enslaved people or whatever. But it just ended up being kind of trite, and you could really honestly just like hold the fast forward button until you get to the moment where he and Zamus reunite, and then that scene is very
very good when they reunite and he's like, uncle, you look terrible, because he's shaved and cut his hair.
Because he's shaved and cut his hair, yeah, exactly.
And he's bloody, of course. But
like, act one again,
I like, you know, one of the things that I find interesting too is like they just have the 80s villain man who's like, that kid scratched my face, now I hate him more. It's like, did we need it? And one of the few things I will say is, I think this movie is really smart and really cool, but an insulting phrase I will use for the third act is cowardly. Because I think it's pretty cowardly that the enemy are these renegade miners that have nothing to do with the Earth people, but the Earth people tolerate them.
With the military that he's a part of.
Yeah, and they just tolerate them.
Yeah.
I think it's cowardly. I think you should have leaned fully into it like Babylon 5 did and just say, no, Earth is unified and terrible. And look, I get it, but at the same time, I think it's just a wimpy way to go. I think it should have just been a part of the actual Earth military force that are like, they try to be like, see, these guys are bad, but so that way when Davidge's friends walk in at the end in their military outfits, we don't feel afraid of them because we know they're nice, even though the beginning of the movie told us they weren't nice, that they're a bunch of xenophobic, bloodthirsty monsters that just love killing. It's like, at least in Starship Troopers, they continued to the very end to hammer home that it's a fascist regime. They didn't puss out. This, it feels cowardly. It feels like the studio or someone came in and said, no, but we got to have the Earth people be good. We can have some bad ones. Get, the guy from Blade Runner. Get the guy from Tango and Cash to be the guy with the scar on his face who's cackling and literally hurling himself and has a greasy ponytail. Like, fuck off with that shit.
Right.
But,
yeah, that's a
But
really
then
good
you get
point.
to the end where he meets up with Davidge again, Zamis, who, we haven't talked much about, but great child performance. And I'm glad to hear that he's still acting. That guy's still around. He does a lot of voice work. I
noticed, yeah.
pretty sure he does Falcon in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
Marvel games and TV shows as the voice of Falcon, and a few other big hitters, but mainly Falcon, I see. So, good, he's still around, because I thought impressive child performance, especially consider this. We haven't even talked about this that much, but Louis Gossett Jr. and that child are acting under some of the most interesting, heavy alien prosthetics I've ever seen in a movie, yet they can still come across through all of that makeup. You guys have covered Babylon 5, where there are actors under heavy makeup that can come through it and some that couldn't. And think about it. This kid's, like 8, maybe?
Yeah, can't be any older than that.
And he could manage to act through all of that makeup. I couldn't imagine doing that.
Yeah.
That in itself is an achievement. That in itself is, like, impressive. But then he just becomes a tool at the end to get kidnapped. And you're like, that's another thing. It feels disrespectful to Zamis as a character that he becomes a plot device. Because up until that point, he was like a real character.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's equated to a damsel in distress.
A MacGuffin to collect and then say the end. And look, I would rather you scrap that and just have him, if we're going to go for the full, each act as a different movie, go to the Drak homeworld at the end and have some stuff there and actually see the ceremony proper instead of like a faraway shot.
Yeah. Just actually kill Willis Davidge and like follow Zamis.
Yeah.
No, don't kill
something.
Willis. He deserves to be.
Yeah, he's dead. He's
No,
dead.
fuck
dead.
you.
No,
He's
he
alive.
is dead. Well, but he lives on in the lineage.
He does, I
is the
get
new
that,
name.
but at the same time, I want someone to be happy in this, and we get it. Like,
Well, I think Zamis gets to be
happy
That's
with having both parental figures brutally dead?
Heck yeah. Wait, no.
You want him to be a war orphan? Jeez.
Yeah, I
But-
guess you're right. But yeah, I agree with the sort of frustration of like kind of taking Zamis out of the story, because what it ends up doing is disrupting what I thought was a really interesting thing for him to have to go through, which is like the only person that he knows, or they know, I guess, in the whole world is Willis. And so Zamis sees Willis and is like, well, I want to be like Uncle, because this is literally the only person I know. And it's upsetting to me that there are things that make me different from Uncle because I love Uncle so much.
Yeah.
And I wanted to see Zamis go through the process of like meeting other Drak and learning about what it means to be Drak and learning to like admire that and admire himself and love the fact that he's only got 3 fingers. But then when he meets Willis again, he has this weird line where he's like, and will I give my 4th and 5th fingers now,
Yeah.
Uncle, or whatever? And it's like, what? No, that's not your story. You're not supposed to still want more fingers. You're supposed to be happy with
You're
who
meant
you
to
are.
love Uncle, not humans in general.
Yeah.
Right.
He wants to be a real boy. He's Pinocchio.
And again, I love the end. Bartek, you said, I love the ending. I love him being added to the lineage and the ceremony, and you see their planet. Like, you actually get to see, like, it's mainly water. And again, it's not too heavy and you have to work within a budget. I get it. So I thought that was a satisfying ending, but it's just like studio notes. Like, now have a random narrator man who's not fucking Dennis Quaid, who we've had throughout the whole movie. Like, who? I forget. Was that someone in the movie who randomly comes in at the end to tell us, like, a bedtime story about what happened? Because
I
I'm like,
I don't think
because
so.
I was thinking, is that the old Drak guy that was in charge, like the head guy of the camp? But then it was like, but that guy had the Drak accent, while this narration doesn't. So no, I don't know. Like, I like the ending, like the end ending, but the third act is a fucking hot mess, and that's the thing. Like, I think that is a part of what holds this back from being a true sci-fi cult classic. Like this, I'm sure people would say it is a cult classic, but really I don't hear many people, if ever, talk about Enemy Mine outside of the cool makeup design, which is, again, it is cool. My favorite part is the little flappy things on the edges of his lips that puff up. I like those. Those are nice little touches. Or how wherever his ears are supposed to be, how they throb. Weirdly, I like the fact that there's throbbing going on in the makeup. It shows that they went to the extra level.
You're always saying that.
I love throbbing Alan. I love throbbing Alan all night long.
I know, Ryan. Believe me, I know.
So, yeah, one of the things I want to touch on before we wrap this out is we mentioned before the gender stuff. I want to wrap around because I mentioned that I want to talk about this. I personally really like the conversation before Jerry dies about how we humans, like Davidge, you're alone. You're truly alone. And like Jerry's point of view about like you are so alone that you've separated your genders off, and that brief union together is one of the closest times you're there to not being alone. And I think that's such an interesting sci-fi way of kind of grappling that idea of loneliness, and how throughout human culture we've seen like the separation of gender and that kind of idea of men are men and women are women, and like there's this even within our own internal society, like there's a separation from different groups, whether it be genders, whether it be races or whatever it is. And you have a race like the Drak who don't understand that concept at all, to the point in which they don't even have genders. And I thought it was an interesting way of exploring that I haven't seen a sci-fi thing do. And I found it actually pretty profound and interesting. What do you think about that, Bartek? The idea that, you're alone because of all of these factors that the human condition has, whether it be gender or whatever it is. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that feels like very much like you've mentioned a few times throughout this episode that a lot of the allegorical things in this film are kind of general and can apply to a lot of situations. I think that one's tapping into like cultural differences and cultural perspectives. It's like, for example, when I went to India, like the general attitude that people would have to me and to each other on the street is a lot more friendly and open than down here in Melbourne. So like I had a bit of a culture shock when I came back from India and I went to Chatz shopping centre and everyone was just minding their own business. Completely normal, but after 3 weeks of something completely different, it felt very weird.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you guys think about this? Because, Alan, you brought it up before as a bit of a weird moment in the movie.
It's Magellan. Okay, Magellan actually really helped me contextualize this and make sense of this scene when we were watching it, because I was like, my knee-jerk reaction whenever people talk about the gender binary is just to feel weird and uncomfortable and to squirm a little bit. But like we've been saying, that is something Jerry would totally say. This isn't even like, oh, it's the 80s. They thought about things differently. Like, no. This is literally like presumably an asexually reproducing alien character being like, you guys are so separate that it's almost cute and beautiful that the time that you guys get to connect is when you copulate. We don't even do that. We just connect on other things besides sex. And he finds that charming and interesting. I think it actually works better in the film than I gave it credit for. I just am trying to emphasize that the point I'm coming from is this whole like men have these things and women have these things is always a little bit strange to me.
Yeah, and I kind of looked at the Jerry sword not just as beautiful, but really I saw that he looked at it as like a tragedy for us humans. Like, you guys are alone.
Yeah,
you guys are alone.
Yeah, totally.
That's like the closest you get to being together. It's only fleeting. We don't have we are together all the time. We get each other, like, that kind of thing a little bit. But John, you want to touch upon this?
Yeah, I think to speak to the sort of critique that Alan's making a little bit further, it is interesting that I think the critique that you can make is that Jerry is pairing the concept of sex with the concept of the gender binary, and like maybe that is the issue. But it makes sense that Jerry, as an asexually reproducing organism, would understand things that way. But obviously, we know that like two people who are men can have sex with each other and like feel united in a fleeting way for that moment. So like that's what's weird about that moment in the movie. But I think that was the closest that the movie gets to trying to make a point about the cultural differences between humans and Drak. And being a human, I kind of see a tragedy in Jerry's experience where maybe Jerry doesn't feel alone, but like Jerry doesn't get to meet their kid.
Oh yeah.
Or the person who comes before them in their lineage, presumably. I'm guessing that this Aldrock died.
No, it was just
in
something wrong with
childbirth.
Jerry. That was the point.
Oh, really? That was
and
specific
think about it. We
to
meet
that.
old Drac.
Yeah, that was the main thing I was thinking of.
It was something
But
specifically.
you gotta split their guts open to get the kid
No,
out.
no. If you look, the guts, I think, were supposed to open on their own because they don't have any genitals to give birth to the child. You see there's little prongs. That's why he had to open it himself because it wasn't opening properly. That's what my interpretation is. But again, the film doesn't lean too heavy into the exposition of like, in my race, we give birth by opening up our bellies, blah, 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 blah.
Yeah, if Jerry felt like the oldest Drac in the film, then that would have probably lended to that interpretation, but he doesn't. He feels like kind of middle.
Yeah, I find it interesting too. Like, I think a tragedy to the Drac too is they don't get a choice. Like, you just become pregnant. That's just, and they think of it, but that's the thing.
Right.
They think of it culturally as like a joyous thing. I don't. I would be like, I would like to have a choice from my human perspective.
That would be your monologue if you were in the film. Like, I think it's sad that you don't have a choice.
Yeah, but
And just that their sort of feeling of like not being alone comes at the expense of, yeah, so I was born at the part of the cycle where I got this name, and then this name comes next, and it'll circle back around to my name again eventually. And there's kind of like, there's a loss of what it means to be an individual in that, which is a sort of classic thing of like, you know, to what extent is that feeling of individuality worth the feeling of isolation? And I think that's an interesting theme that the film like gestures towards, but doesn't really investigate much beyond that particular conversation.
yeah, and it's all interesting, and I think too, like, let's not mention this, but I don't think the film isn't aware that it has a lot of queer coding stuff going on with the whole fact that you have these two guys that are super psyched to be dads.
Oh yeah.
Didn't I say that during our watching with John? I was like, this is in real life. If this happened, they would have made love multiple times. By the time they got picked
you can't
up.
make love with Jerry.
Right.
Yeah, that's true.
I'll get
That's
intimate.
true.
I have a
Oh, exactly. They would have been intimate.
I have a random gripe with IMDb. I don't know if it's like this on your IMDb, but why the fuck is Jerry credited as Drac on IMDb? I don't know why. He's he's not credited as Jerry on IMDb, at least on my phone. Maybe it's
Jerry's the name given to him. Drac. He doesn't have it. We hear the name that's actually his, and they never use it.
yeah,
again.
but
it includes. But you should just call him Jerry for the sake of
that's how
consistency.
credits work. They don't call him
Yeah,
Drac
yeah.
throughout the whole movie. They call him Jerry.
It must have been on a different website, but I saw him credited as like the first word of his name,
And
then
then-
quote Jerry, then the last part of his name.
Which is neat. They actually give him his full name. But
It's
yeah.
like Bartłomiej Bartek Kasprzak.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I want to touch on, because I got Bartek here, is I've seen some people complain that Zamus doesn't have a full-on American accent because he was raised by an American man.
Mm-hmm.
I want to touch upon that because he does have a partial American accent, but he does also have the Drac accent, and I think it's interesting because Bartek, one of the things that I've realized over the years is you grew up in a bilingual family. Your mum's Polish, speaks Polish, you speak Polish, but you don't have full grasp of it. But every now and then, you just have a different accent. Like every now and then, words will come through with a real Polish lean, even though you've grown up your whole life in Australia.
Yeah.
And I find that an interesting
I've noticed
thing.
I've noticed that in sentences where I say my name, it tends to be a bit more because I want to like emphasize the R in my name.
Or with W's. I've noticed that with W's too. Like
Yeah?
you pronounce the word like I've won a game differently to me.
Oh right, yeah.
You pronounce it
You've
with a
told-
heavy "wo."
That one I've never noticed until you brought it up.
Yeah, so it's like I kind of saw it as like the kid has a bit of both accents because he wasn't full on Drac, but he wasn't full on like I'm an American boy. But also they have weird mouths with weird teeth, so they will have different pronunciations than us anyway.
It reminded me of a compliment I gave in our. This might be funny because I'm bringing this film up, but in our Coneheads episode
Great
a few
film.
years ago, when I mentioned like when we met the daughter character in that, She felt like a very genuine, like, kind of mishmash of, like, yeah, she's got what was their race called again?
Coneheads.
Was it just coneheads? Oh, yeah, she's got a mix of, like, the coneheads race because, you know, she's part of the family. She grew up with these parents, but she also grew up in America. So you have this, like, kind of fusion of, like, yeah, she understands, like, the quirks of both.
A second generation.
Yeah, so, and even though we didn't get as much of that in this film with the kid character, at least, like, with the way he spoke, it was very distinct from Jerry.
Yeah, it was. And also, I don't think I would need the 8-year-old child actor to try and do the heavy, gargly accent that Louis Gossett Jr. had mastered from when he was a child with his toothbrushing. Because we've heard about that story, right? Did you hear about that one? Louis Gossett Jr., I think, talked about, like, he developed this voice or accent when he was, like, a little kid brushing his teeth. And you like have all the mouthful of like spit, and when you're gargling, and he would walk around to his mother, being like doing that, and he came up with that. So, and he still does it at conventions. When people ask him, he's like, "Oh boy, I'll give you some Jerry."
See, I didn't know about the toothbrushing thing. On the IMDb trivia, it just mentioned that he builds up a lot of saliva and does it.
Yeah.
So I just imagine like, oh, if anyone requests it, he has to like build it up for a few minutes.
Like Goku for a whole episode, he has to build up his energy.
Just the one episode.
Yeah, just one, no, 15, sorry. I'm sorry, I forgot Dragon Ball. So, that's it. Enemy Mine. Would we recommend it?
No, not good.
Whoa.
Just add the just add the explosion after it. Not good.
I do recommend it.
Yeah. What about you, Magellan? Recommend this?
Yeah, I mean it's definitely not part of the like Sci-fi 101 curriculum. It's a sort of like special study in sci-fi films kind of thing. But I think if you're in the mood for something that looks really cool and has a lot of great visuals and has something to say and is kind of like a deconstruction of Star Trekky, Star Warsy stuff, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I would recommend it to folks who are looking for that sort of thing.
Alan, recommendation from you or no?
Yes. Be aware what you're getting into. This is not your Star Wars. This is not an action-packed... Well, it gets there, but if you're looking for action, just watch the last 30 minutes or watch something else. If you're looking for meaningful, like interesting conversations, some beautiful backgrounds, and some great costume work, definitely 100% recommend.
Yeah, I recommend it. It's great. I love it. I mean, you know, it's got all the things that I want from a sci-fi movie: characters, interesting alien designs, a world, themes, some cool spaceship battles. I actually liked the spaceship battles at the beginning. I thought they were fun. But yeah, it's good. I think the music's really good too. We haven't touched upon that, but I think it was really well done. I thought it matched. I recommend this. Of course I do. I think more people need to get their eyes on this bad boy. Personally, it's one of my favorite Dennis Quaid performances too. Like, I got introduced to Dennis Quaid, like I think a lot of people did, which is through the film Inner Space. The film in which he's like in a little ship that's been shrunk down to the size of a cell, and he's been injected into Martin Short. Oh, yeah. Great film. Okay. And he's talking to Martin Short, who's a hypochondriac. That's a great film. Inner Space by our good boy Joe Dante Bartek, Small Soldiers himself.
He truly is a small soldier in that film.
Yeah, no, he is. I mentioned that in Small Soldiers, and of course that film has Robert Picardo from Star Trek Voyager. But yeah, I recommend this. I love this film. Highly, highly love. I just want to touch one of my favorite Jerry lines was his first real line in English, which was "sheets." The way he does it is so good. But yeah, that's it. Bartek, are you ready to hear the recommendation from our listening people?
I'm excited.
Our listening people have recommended a sequel to a film.
Okay.
Where the sequel is apparently so bad it's good. So I want to do this challenge. I want to watch just the sequel. Could you watch the first one and the sequel to see if it's so bad it's good, or just bad because it's a terrible follow-up? Mm-hmm. Or if it's just bad on its own rights.
Okay.
Or if it's actually a secret gem. We're watching the Highlander II.
Oh, right. Yes, I've heard of this.
Oh, hell yeah.
Quickening.
Oh, hell yeah.
I have never seen a Highlander movie before. I've never seen the show. I've heard the Highlander is really good, but the second one is garbage. So I want you, Bartek, to you be our Highlander expert when you walk in, and I'll be the novice. Because that seems to be our banter. When we did Star Wars, you're like, okay, I'll watch all of the prequels. You can talk about Revenge of the Sith. I'm like, I'm never going back, baby. Never again will I see Jar Jar in my lifetime.
You watched Wolf Creek 1.
I did watch Wolf Creek 1 because I hadn't seen Wolf Creek 1, so I thought I better prep for Wolf Creek 2 when we covered that. But that's it. Alan Magellan, where can people find you and your podcast on the internet?
Midge, I think I did it last time. Do you want to give it a shot?
Sure. So you can listen to us talking about TV shows every week on your local podcast player. If you search Chatz, a television podcast, that's CHATZ, a television podcast, because it's like it's like, remember the 90s when it was cool to use these? We're still doing it. You can also find us at chatspod.simplecast.com. Or if you would like, because you like us so much, we also have a Patreon over at, what's that? Patreon.com/chatspod. Yeah.
There it is.
So, there you go.
You got there. You got there at the end. What's Patreon? Oh, Patreon. Oh, right.
I'm still wondering what a Z is.
Right.
Yeah, what's a Z? We call him a Z down here, baby. Zed's dead, baby.
Oh, sorry. CHATZ.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, you guys are covering great stuff at the moment. You guys are going through like mini-series. So
yeah,
you're tackling, what is it, Vanity Fair right now? I know.
Vanity Fair, and then we're going to be talking about HBO's Angels in America miniseries, and then we're going to follow that up with coverage of the 90s adaptation of The Stand, the Stephen King book. So that's going to be some campy nonsense.
Yeah, it'll be a time. So make sure, listening people, to go follow them on all of that stuff. We'll include some links to those in the description, of course, as we usually do. You can find us on all the podcatchers as well. You can find us on the social medias of Facebook and Twitter, Spit and Polish Presents. You can email us at spitandpolished@gmail.com. That is spitandpolished@gmail.com. You can email us with your questions, queries, thoughts, concerns, and recommendations. Also, our social medias, you can recommend us movies on there. As I said, we are in need of some more recommendations for movies, so hit us up and we'll add it to our list, our devil's list of things, because people are like, these guys like Big Fat Liar. They'll surely like bad movies. No, we like good movies.
Yeah. You put down Big Fat Liar 2.
Or Thunderpants. So,
No, not Thunderpants.
yes, Thunderpants. You have to watch it. It's great. So, I appreciate you guys coming on, discussing Enemy Mine with us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I was questioning, should I tell them what this movie is, or just let them watch it? And I go by the rule of, if they want to know, they can just look it up. I said it was sci-fi, and that was enough. So
going into this movie cold was the right way to watch it. Yeah.
I agree.
Cold shiver down your spine. Yes. Bartek, a pleasure to talk to you, but I'm afraid we're going to have to end this discussion, because I've got some big green Jello balls to eat to keep my sustenance up, and I've got to look after a kid. Okay, can you handle that, Bartek?
Pleasure talking to you too, Ryan.